In this video, we're going to discuss the concept of excise taxes. So an excise tax is just a tax that's been imposed on specific goods and services. And this key word here is specific. So it's not a broad general tax on goods and services like a sales tax. So when we think about the types of specific goods and services that are typically subjected to an excise tax, we think about things like fuel, like gasoline, things like alcohol, beer, cigarettes, air travel, phone service. So these are the types of things you typically have an excise tax on. So even though it's not as broad as, for example, a sales tax, this is still a very important tax because the excise tax can actually be quite high on some of these things, right? So it might be, for example, for a package of cigarettes, maybe there's a federal excise tax of $1 per pack. So when we think of, and I should probably mention here that when we talk about whether the excise tax is being imposed, it's imposed, it could be a federal excise tax or it could be a state excise tax. So either of these governments here can impose excise taxes. So again, now this kind of begs a comparison to a sales tax, and I really want to explain what an excise tax is relative to a sales tax. That might give you an easier way to kind of conceptualize this. So it's different from a sales tax because it's going to affect fewer goods and services, and this is one of the key concepts here, right? If you go into a grocery store or you go into a retailer and you start picking items off the shelves, most of them are not going to have an excise tax associated with them. However, most of them are going to be subject to sales tax. So it's really less broad, right? So this is the excise is less broad in terms of its applicability. So excise tax is less broad, right? Now, that's not the only difference, though, when we think about an excise tax versus the sales tax. And one key thing is when we remember the sales tax, is typically the sales tax, we've got like a percentage, right? It's a percentage, maybe it's 6.8% of the retail price and so forth. But a lot of times an excise tax will actually be calculated per unit, right? And by per unit, we're talking like per package of cigarettes, per gallon of gasoline, and so forth. So that's a key difference between, and that actually, it obviously affects the way it's calculated. So in addition to that, though, and this is kind of a weird thing about excise taxes relative to a sales tax, is that it's kind of hidden, right? And there's this nice way of putting it. We call it an indirect tax, but really it's, I'll just call it here, we'll call it hidden. So it's a hidden tax, and it's hidden in the sense that when you go and make a purchase, that if there's an excise tax on the gasoline, that was imposed on the manufacturer, on the seller, right? So they have incurred that tax, and then now it's not necessarily going to show up on your receipt, right? So let's say it's let me change pen here. So get a little better penmanship. So let's say it's 10 cents a gallon excise tax on the fuel that you purchase. So the seller, the manufacturer, they've already incurred this tax, right? They paid that. Let's say it was a federal excise tax. They've already paid that. And so you might think, oh, well, then it doesn't even affect me as a consumer. Well, it does, because what they're going to do is that the manufacturer, so let's see here, the manufacturer, they're going to pass that tax on to you as the consumer, right? So they're going to put this on the consumer. And how do they do that? Well, they're just going to charge you an extra 10 cents a gallon when you purchase your fuel. So in a sense, when you have this federal excise tax, even though it's like this indirect tax, it's really on the manufacturer, the person or the organization selling you the item. In reality, it's going to get passed on to the consumer, to you, when you pay for that fuel. But you don't see it. You just assume that that's what gasoline costs, or that's what a package of cigarettes costs. But in reality, there's these excise taxes that you might not even know about. And that's obviously different from sales taxes, where sales tax is just going to be able to clearly delineate it on the receipt. And also, when we think about the magnitude of an excise tax, it's typically going to be much, much higher than a sales tax. These are not kind of trivial taxes that are small in magnitude and so forth. They can actually be quite large. and so it'll definitely have an impact on the price that the consumer is paying, right? We're not typically talking like, a penny per package of cigarettes or something like that. And so these excise taxes can actually be so large. Actually, the first excise tax, the first federal excise tax, was passed when Washington was president, and it actually led, it was so high that it made farmers really, really angry, and it led to something in 1794 called the Whiskey Rebellion. So these excise taxes are not a joke, and they could actually be quite large. We don't really have anybody rebelling over them today, but at least in the same sense they did in 1794. But they're not trivial taxes. They are large, and it's important that you understand what kind of federal excise taxes exist and on which items they exist, because they're not on all goods and services, but when they are on a certain good or service, it can actually be quite high, and because it's hidden, you won't know unless you actually know beforehand of the kind of